Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to today's episode. Today's episode is I guess it has one where its roots arise from an emotional intelligence. I guess I'll tell you. You see, the title awaiting redemption of the target soul is this notion that we human beings live certain programmed lives. However, we do have a free will, so it's like even though we find ourselves in a sort of habitual or certain pattern of existence, we experience that pattern in new ways. So what that means is as if the system of life is repeating. Human beings are being it's like constantly reproduced and generated, and in some sense the species, people die, people are born, but as people die and people are born, the human experience is novel, and there's new eyes opening for the first time on this planet. The human being finds itself in an existential position where, in regards to its ideas, it is in an inner room. Your imagination is like a room you only have access to unless you communicate it or express it. These thoughts, these words that you're hearing, they are in a sort of they have a sort of internal constitution, and if that internal constitution does not have any sort of dynamism or change to it, language will not arise. That means I could look at a tree without having the concept or the idea of a tree there, but I could look at a tree with having the idea, the concept, the scientific explanation of the atomic structure and its constitution and the various ways that the tree exists and what trees mean in stories and how trees were used as a metaphor for knowledge. This is why we say branches of knowledge, you know, different branches of study. And so what I'm saying is like the object could just be in the objective reality without any subjective imposition upon it, or it can in some sense be something that is so subjectively layered with various realities that it's never the same thing, right? This is the sense of importance. It's as if we don't realize, but we in some sense are not just spirits, we imbue the objective phenomena with meaning, which is a sort of kind of spiritual process in some sense. I say spiritual because, I mean, honestly, that word gets a bad rap nowadays, you know. But it comes from the breath. The word soul and breath, at least in many Eastern cultures, it arises from the term breath. So when the person would stop breathing, it would be as if the person's last breath was as if their soul leaving their body. That would come across that way. Suddenly this animated full biological, human form suddenly becomes inanimate. It becomes inanimate because a vital requirement of the body is in some sense denied. You see, any child that is born, I find if you're born, every person's ready to die since the moment they're born because they can confront their spontaneous origination in existence. You can also confront your spontaneous dismissal out of existence. But my whole point is that we have a sort of consciousness here, this free will of ours. It is not just something that it's given and you just have it. It's something that we must be responsible to direct. So most people, you see, if you want a glass of water, what do? You, in some sense, think of the thoughts arise. All right, go to the cupboard, grab a cup, fill it up from the refrigerator, and drink that glass of water. Now, when you think, about the movement and the advancement of your civilization. It has certain procedures. When you think of how thoughts are approaching you throughout the day, it has certain procedures. No thought comes to man alone. All thoughts are codependent to their opposite polarity. It's as if there's no coin that is one-sided. Similarly, there's no concept, no linguistic term that is one-sided. If you notice something about language, it is kept in a duality. For me, it has to do with existential sensitivity. Every day, like I've given these talks often, and every time I come to give the talk, I find myself, I find the moment to be a new moment where at least the experiences relating to the existential phenomena differently. In order to be able to speak about something, it needs to be something that's observable, you know? That means until man found some sort of mirror, he was lost to the first person mode of life. And from the first person mode of life, there is a lot of our evolutionary, it's as if every state of mind of every human has kind of sculpted the genetical structure in different ways. Hegel, this German, I believe German philosopher, there is something notable that he has done, and what he has done is, in some sense, critique Rene Descartes. Hegel was a philosopher, you can say, that came after Descartes. You know, Rene Descartes is a very notable figure. I'm pretty sure people in the West know who he is, and people in France, of course, they know who he is. Rene Descartes had this approach to existence and to truth where it was through doubting. He had a sort of methodical doubt to find out, to associate truth to what can no longer be doubted. And he looked at existence and he realized he could doubt everything external, but he cannot doubt the internal position of the one asking the question. So, in some sense, he reached the conclusion, Rene Descartes, that the ancient yogis and mystics of India reached, which in some sense was that he realized he could not doubt the isolated thinking subject. In ancient India, they say the seer of sight is unseen. The hearer of sound is like you cannot hear it. It's like the observer that's aware it's observing cannot be observed, right? So there is, on some level, a sort of first person point of experience that we cannot escape. It is just the presence of the life force. What can we say about a world that changes based on a macrocosmic intelligence that doesn't care too much for the microcosm? That earthquake in Japan, it was not a conscious phenomena. It was unconscious. It was kind of like, you see, it tends to be man's consciousness attacking the unconscious. What does that mean? That means before we stepped out of the animal, the food chain, before we as a species evolved beyond the food chain, unknown forces would approach the person. You could walk in the street and like walk in the forest and like jungle or something, and a tiger could attack you. On a saber-toothed tiger could jump out of nowhere. So it's one of those situations. It's one of those situations where, is this recording? Yeah. It's one of those situations where the unknown would be violent and savage to man. But after we stepped into some sort of tribal, advanced, and sophisticated civility, we, in some sense, began making bits and pieces of heaven for ourselves on this earth. That means that person who built shelter from the storm, he was in a sort of heaven. It wasn't the ultimate view, Abrahamic religion of heaven, but it was a moment where satisfaction was allowed to continue. So as we in the civil kind of dynamic, I feel it's kind of like a back and forth, like a sine wave. So what that means is there was external savageness. We tamed this external savageness, and it became external order. So there was external chaos. Through the efforts of our species, we managed to come to a point right now, it's 2019, where the external chaos is has been reduced incredibly. We're living as creatures without too much chaotic phenomena. Not that there isn't. There's people in the world who are going through hell, but I'm telling you, it's like the world has advanced. Something has changed. There has been more people are living in higher standards of living, which permit them a sort of freedom to even observe the world without constantly being attacked by the unknown or certain things happening which will give them the impression that life is beyond their control. And the moment life is beyond your control, your free will becomes your identity, and ego becomes transparent. For me, it's as if before I could ask God a question, I had to ask nature a question. And I looked at nature and I watched what is it doing, and I realized, oh my God, it only has manifest power. That means existence's power is that it's here. And so it's as if like our purpose per se is not some ideological construct that at the end of our life we're satisfied by the ideas we have or the ideas we made real, but in some sense it's one of those things where the person finds contentment with nature's processes. This is what I honored about the scientific mind until it began becoming too unnatural. In uh, uh, um, every great branch of knowledge has originated due to great people. I'm not joking. Human beings have been creating each other's minds since the beginning of time. Sorry about that, guys. I had to take care of something. You see, life, when it has suffering, it will also have redemption. I think the way kind of nature is designed is we start off as children with simpler experiences and conditional, in a conditional moment. The moment we require to trust the world to in sunset for it to happen for us. As the child grows up, its consciousness its ego becomes jaded a bit. It begins to look at the suffering of the world. It begins to see how once it thought the conditions of existence were easy, now they have become complex. Now, what to do with their complexity? You can say civilization and society, like the civilization is once it morally brushes its teeth. Civilization is an environment where people's inner realities have an opportunity to become external to other inner realities. When you are alone, your sense of personhood is very different than when you're with others, whether you believe it or not, even on a subconscious level, because you're just considering more factors, more intelligent factors to the moment. The texture of the moment changes. You see, I have in some sense, I find myself as an advanced communicator. I find all human beings as advanced communicators. And the way that ideology arose in my mind is that I realized we're all advanced communications of the universal sector. The human beings on this planet, are the most evolved species. So first, there must come the clarity of the existential position. Then comes the alignment of the experiential reality. So right now, the way people are experiencing this earth is not in its clearest state. It is not in the most efficient. I cannot accept that this modern world of ours is modern because there's too many ancient ideas hovering about. But it's not the issue with the ancient idea. It just has to do with the relationship of a creature on the surface of a rock, on a pebble in the middle of nowhere, and how these creatures relate to the moment. You see, fundamentally, it's just pure experience. When you're born as a child, like if you retain memories, I have memories before I learned language. I was just watching the world. I watched the world before language tore it apart into belief systems. I remember that time. It was an easy time. It's like that moment when the child doesn't know language. Who can even talk about it? I have realized the incredibleness of the attention of the human being. I feel our salvation lies in our attention. Pretty much what is going to decide the efficiency and the inefficiency of the civilization just till time infinitum, or let's say at least for the next 10,000 years, if any remnant of human intelligence remains. Some people believe that humanity is an intermediary for a technological eternity. What that means is that we're living through a sort of biological temporary condition, but in like, I don't know, let's say like 700 years in the future, we'd all be inside a computer and that computer would be exploring eternal space eternally. So we would, in some sense, become a sort of self-generating infinity, right? In some sense, evolution seems to be like that. For me, I found it very hilarious that I saw many popular atheists on YouTube try to use evolution to denounce the notion of an eternal being. And I found it very strange because evolution seems to be the urge, the nature's urge to want this creature wants to end and continue till its last day. You know, when a person gets stressed and depressed, they may tell themselves a sad story about themselves to themselves. But I'll tell you, in reality, when reality goes on an emergency level, you will snap out and you have to realize, and that's when you will confront how much you have tamed the animal within. You see, those people who are violent, they haven't even tamed the animal without. They haven't been able to confront their animal nature externally. But after you confront your animal nature externally, it means you're renouncing violence for your lifetime. You just renounce it. You don't need it. Some people feel that power comes from whoever's holding, the biggest hammer of judgment. And let me tell you, it is not like that. Nature is a mountain of intelligence, unique, unexplored intelligence. And human beings have different, listen to what I'm saying here, different rhythmic relationships with the living world. For me, reality is too big to be confined to language. This creates an incredible, fascinating existential problem. That if I am extracting meaning out of this objective material universe through my own subjective processes, then the meaning of the world has a subjective existence. The objectivity is just here. So, how the experience of life changes from just being stuff, the world has a subjective existence. It is a sort of evolutionary ability of our attention to navigate between subjective phenomena and objective phenomena. In reality, the thing is, most people, their life works with stories. Most people who want success, they just want to be acknowledged in a certain way. They want to fit into a story where they're real, not just to themselves but to others as well. This is the social need of the living animal. You see, Charles Bukowski, he's this this incredible writer, American writer, and pretty much his work centered around kind of accurately explaining uh, the hardships of life as he went through them. You know, You can truly see how his characters are part of his eyes. But anyways, Charles Bukowski, he has his last interview. You can go see it on YouTube. In that interview, the interviewer asks this great writer and says, "Do you fear death?" And he says, "No." And it's a strange answer, something like that. And he says, "No." And he says, "Why?" And the guy says, "Why?" And he says, "Because you begin seeing patterns of repetition in cycles of nature. Just like how the seasons change and it goes through a certain pattern, you begin to see the cyclical nature of life. The more temporary you feel in this life, the more the intense the cycles of nature become. You know, this is why in most cultures the children are taught you must honor the senior, you must honor the elder. You know why? Because you will be an elder too in this world. So what that means is eventually the forces of nature will have a harder and harder weight on the person. Now the person who's getting tired is the person who they're energetic, it's their free will, cannot create enough energy for the external environment to still abide by rhythmic intelligence. So there comes a detachment from how your physical body has been animating intelligently with the natural world. This detachment doesn't mean the detachment of the observer. If you notice meditation, what is it? It's just people sitting down quietly, silently and still, and trying to find this observer, trying to see how all the whole moment is a presence. It's not. It has nothing to do with the story of the personality. And people who think it has to do with the story of the personality, they go on running their whole lives trying to find the truth behind the door they cannot see. They become delusioned by the world. The world tells them a story juicy enough for their metaphysical hunger, and they run after it. And it's in some sense kind of very non-elegant. It's not elegant, you know, because you cannot avoid what is here and just live with what you only see. That's what I understood. If I was in an island, sure, I just my beliefs were truth. But when you live in a world where there's many angles, many viewpoints, there's mountains and mountains of unknown exploration ahead. You cannot just lock yourself down in a belief and be like, okay, I found my truth through these words in a book and I'm done. No, the living world will command further from you, will request further from you. Because civilization happens once. And the most easiest, non kind of story way I could say it's just imagine our species, our humanity, it's a science project. It's a science project, a science experiment where after 4 billion years, here we are, and what should we do? And so I am neither fascinated by the religious community and I'm neither fascinated by the secular society, secular community. I'm not fascinated by either because there is in both states of mind an ignorance accepted. The world is trying to be contained in a box so the living attention of the moment feels content. You know, sometimes you gotta dare to look at existence in other ways. It is not always in one paint. It's not only painted with one sense of meaning. What you eventually realize is that at first the truth seeker is seeking truth. He wants truth to be there. He wants to find truth. What do you think happens? He runs after truth, and suddenly when he's about to catch truth, it disappears. It disappears. It disappears every time. And the person is karmically one step behind because their search has not started from their own honest questions. This is why I say the best thing that words can do for the ears of man is to be a mirror of that person's mind. This is the incredible thing. The way I'm saying these words is not the way you're hearing them. You hear them in accordance to your spectrum of various experiences you've gone through. Earlier, I brought up the point of René Descartes, this French philosopher, through his approach of methodical doubt, concluding that the isolated thinking subject cannot be doubted. So, where the concept of doubt existed subjectively for René Descartes, this philosopher, ignited this kind of world for him that he felt about there was a dualism between the mind and the body, as if matter had its certain own intelligence in its own universe, dimensional domain, and suddenly the mind was in its own universe. You see? And so the mind became in its own universe because, in some sense, there came the conclusion that the questioner cannot be questioned, or the meaning of the whole question would be empty. So he said the isolated thinking subject cannot be doubted, a bold claim by Rene Descartes, a great philosopher. Then we see years later Hegel comes into the picture. Hegel, this German philosopher, looks at Rene Descartes, and I believe like Hegel came after Descartes, but I'm telling you, like Hegel responded to Descartes. You see, this is the good thing about true philosophers. They do not ignore the history of philosophy. It has a value for them. So, anyways, Hegel looks at this isolated thinking subject kind of conclusion that Rene Descartes has, this undoubtable for isolated thinking subject. And suddenly Hegel brings in from his, opens his philosophical wings, and in some sense, gives a comeback to Descartes that even the isolated thinking subject can be, in some sense, uh, questioned. It can be doubted. What he thinks cannot be doubted can be doubted because the sense of self comes into existence in accordance to the sense of the world. So you can never be a sense of self without having a sense of the world first to be separate from the world to even be an individual entity. So Hegel's comeback to Rene Descartes was that still the illusion remains. Some philosophers feel they found truth. Some philosophers feel they just found greater illusions. There was even this great debate between Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault is this, again, another, is a French philosopher, and Noam Chomsky is, of course, an MIT professor and incredible speaker for men. And so it was incredible because Noam Chomsky, with the sophistication of an advanced scientist and scholar of language, enters the conversation, and Michel Foucault stands as a sort of next level writer who, in his writings, had spoken about how the kind of structures of the world and the inhibitions to truth, and in some sense, how certain things that were once before, like in nature, accepted as just natural things in the community began constantly become institutionalized. He's kind of saying that, as Michel Foucault in his writings is incredible, he's kind of saying like, as there has been an evolution of civilization towards where we are now, there has also been more externalization of inner judgment of one another. That means, of course, we moved beyond the thing of the age of the Crusades and kind of like the Inquisition and whatnot, of a sort of cruel religious time that there was in our history. But I'm telling you, that cruel religious time, uh, even though that inquisition is gone, people have become inquisitors of each other in regards to a sort of social class system. Now, certain cultures have found ways around this. In some sense, I can say, like in Japanese culture, there's a sort of background of an honor to the person's existence and the existence of their mind and subjectivity. And we go even see in India, for example. Of course, there was the caste system, but there was also a sort of cultural notion that it doesn't matter what kind of whether you were rich or poor, there was the Atman, there was the deeper dimensions of the human being. So in some sense, there was less of a kind of judgment, but I'm not saying the caste system was evidently a cruel system. So, anyways, what I'm trying to say is Michel Foucault and Noam Chomsky, they're speaking about creativity, and Noam Chomsky has this approach where he says creativity is kind of coming from like this sort of in the unconscious. I'm saying it like this, but I can't. My mind can't recollect the exact words Noam Chomsky used, but the picture he was painting was like he was saying that it's coming from a genetical design. So he felt creativity was like in this kind of in the sub intelligence of our DNA. Do you know something like that? And so he's saying about creativity and the ambition to even find truth, and this creativity is gonna, in some sense, lead to truth. And anyways, Michel Foucault, in response to Noam Chomsky's ideas on creativity, tells him that there is something Noam Chomsky has not considered, and this is an incredible debate. Even though the host wasn't that good, like the moderator of the debate was kind of slightly a fool, but like, but Michel Foucault, the way he responds to Noam Chomsky is that he says there are things blocking our sight to the truth. And if we don't consider the external illusions and just think that the inner reality has access to truth directly, if the external illusions are not considered, then truth will always be artificial in them. Something in these sense, guys. Of course, I'm paraphrasing and kind of animating it as much as I can. But all of these kind of went to the sense of the self of the person, and the sense of the self of the person repeats. So believe it or not, for me, every day, of course, is a new day, and how lovely and great. But at the same time, I'm like, okay, again, we play the games of the self, and at the end of the night, you retire from the games of the self, and that's how you sleep. You sleep empty-handed. That means that you're no longer holding thoughts in the mind's eye. I have this kind of hypothesis, and it may be too soon for me to share, but I feel I should share it now. And so this hypothesis is, in some sense, I kind of have, it's become real for me that in a subtler dimension where your forehead is, when you imagine things, that imagination is being projected from there. So imagine like if there was a 3D kind of light simulation, right? Imagine from your forehead, you're simulating. You're simulating phenomena. The forehead is an incredible kind of antenna that strangely at the same time expresses and receives, right? So sometimes when you'll notice this, and when something like whenever someone, like I've personally read certain ancient things, like been overwhelmed by data. The moment I'm overwhelmed by data, I put my palm, the center of my palm, on my forehead, and it instantly, when I do that in my subtler plane, certain imagination stops. Certain imagination is existence appears in patterns. You go through these patterns and eventually find some sort of experiential contentment. That experiential contentment translates into a subjective version of the objective world. In that subjective world, there is a free will that can animate it. So this is why you can look at the world now and wonder what will happen in 10,000 years from now. The mind can animate that vision because it is constantly reworking and restructuring the subjective consideration, the subjective duplicate of the objective world. I hope this talk has served you. I want to kind of explain to you when I give these talks, it's kind of incredible because it's the same process for me as sometimes when I choose to animate, is that it's like if you ask yourself an honest question, your whole honest intelligence applies itself. When your whole honest, like the value of honesty was a level of freedom of mind which provided the free will with a greater spectrum to shape itself into decision. I'm going to go into what I call in these talks a quote tunnel of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. And a quote tunnel is when I just focus on like a certain unique figure in history, and I just kind of share their quotes, which kind of can give a suggestion of how their mind is open, how the mind of that person is open. So, anyways, Hegel says the learner always begins by finding fault, but the scholar sees the positive merit in everything. Hegel says nothing great in the world has ever been accomplished without passion. Hegel says animals are in possession of themselves. Their soul is in possession of their body, but they have no right to their life because they do not will it. Hegel says the history of the world is none other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom. Hegel says too fair to worship, too divine to love. Hegel says genuine tragedies in the world are not conflicts between right and wrong, they are conflicts between two rights. Incredible quote there. He's saying every person's looking from their own world and they're right in it. Hegel says it is easier to discover a deficiency in individuals and states and in providence than to see their real import and value. Hegel says we do not need to be shoemakers to know if our shoes fit, and just as little have we any need to be professionals to acquire knowledge of matters of universal interest. He's right, because the world is accessible to all. Everybody can ask the question. Hegel says when liberty is mentioned, we must always be careful to observe whether it is not really the assertion of private interest which is thereby designated. Hegel says to him who looks upon the world rationally, the world in its turn presents a rational aspect. The relation is mutual. Yeah, a self-reflective pattern. Hegel says education is the art of making man ethical. And I think the reason Hegel says that is because the ethics at its core has to do with natural value. So it's a return to nature. So you gotta not just get facts in your head. You have to look at the moment and see where the real value of life is in that moment and take care of it or allow it to continue. Hegel says truth in philosophy means that concept and external reality correspond. Yeah, this is clear. Hegel says, mark this well, you proud men of action. You are, after all, nothing but unconscious instruments of the men of thought. Wow. Hegel says an idea is always a generalization, and generalization is a property of thinking. To generalize means to think. All that is real is reasonable, and all that is reasonable is real. He says, I'm not ugly, but my beauty is a total creation. Oh, wow. This man has style. He says, Hegel says, amid the pressure of great events, a general principle gives no help. Yeah, you need strategy. Hegel says governments have never learned anything from history or acted on principles deducted from it. Okay. Hegel says once the state has been founded, there can no longer be any heroes. They come on the scene only in uncivilized conditions. Hegel says world history is a court of judgment. Hegel says he says the few assume to be the deputies, but they are often only the despoilers of the many. And Hegel also says, I don't think I read this, he says world history is a court of judgment. And that's true. We impose the values and the meaning because we created language just like the caveman with fire. Our knowledge will, till the end of time, be self-reflective. And this is why Mr. Within says the educational system will experience an apocalypse. It will see the hollowness of thought because as when you pay more attention to the thought than the living reality, the thoughts inevitably become hollow because the thoughts are meant to represent the living reality. So if you think of all the human beings that have their imaginations and just personal desires have literally taken their attention away from caring for what world they're living in and what world they're living behind. This is why I say our species is a young species, like 8-year-old species. You know? Our civilization is an extremely young civilization. It doesn't know. It knows, like it can know, it can hear the instruction of, for example, the parent saying, don't do that, 8-year-old kid. And then the 8-year-old kid, and he hears and understands it, but still is acting in accordance to past realities. I think people don't celebrate their birthdays properly. The proper way to celebrate a birthday is to acknowledge what occurred in that year and just hold on to what was memorable. For me, so many ideas have come and gone throughout the years. But for me, what has remained was what had value in my own wonder of what the world is. So the redemption comes from the tired soul changing its axiom of conceptual existence in accordance with a direct experience of nature. So you're not alone when the whole world is here. This is why I guess I give these talks. Because language, like any technology, requires to be updated. Much blessings and namaste.